Texas, 1867. Wes Callahan had seen a lot of strange things on the trail: coyotes stealing bacon, drunken peddlers singing love songs to their mules. But he'd never seen a silk-dressed woman sleeping in his wagon. He stood at the edge of the open flap, boots planted in the dirt, arms crossed, and stared at the figure curled in the hay like some misplaced debutante. Her dress was travel-worn but well-made. Her bonnet was askew, and her gloves, white, delicate, were folded neatly beside her head like a pillow. She was breathing softly.
"What in the blue hell?"
Wes muttered. As if sensing the weight of his disbelief, the girl stirred. Her eyes blinked open, startled, clear, the colour of strong tea, and she sat up abruptly, disoriented but not frightened. Then she saw him.
"Oh,"
she said simply.
"That's all you've got to say?"
Wes asked.
"Oh?"
She adjusted her bodice and sat up straighter.
"Good morning."
"Miss,"
he said, removing his hat, more out of habit than courtesy.
"you're in my wagon."
"Yes,"
she replied, smoothing her skirt.
that was rather the idea.
"The idea?"
He repeated.
"Lady, I don't know what kind of trouble you're running from, but—"
"I'm not asking you to be involved,
she said calmly.
only to take me as far as Coyote Bend."
Wes rubbed a hand down his jaw.
"And if I say no?"
"Then I'll climb down and figure out another way."
she said, looking him square in the eye.
"But I'd be grateful if you didn't."
There was no trembling in her voice, no drama, just the quiet determination of someone who'd made up her mind and planned to endure the consequences. Wes exhaled through his nose.
"What's your name?"
"Jane Bennett."
He narrowed his eyes.
"You one of those Bennetts from Red Hollow?"
"Yes?"
Wes swore under his breath and turned from the wagon. She didn't speak, didn't try to follow him or plead. He paced a few yards away, thinking hard. It was 2 days to Coyote Bend, too far to turn back, too risky to leave her alone on the trail. And she didn't look like the kind who'd run off for fun. He came back with a tight expression.
"You'll ride in the wagon, keep your head down, and stay out of the way.
"I understand."
And when we get to town, you're on your own."
"Of course."
He nodded once. She nodded back. Wes climbed onto the wagon bench and shook the reins, muttering under his breath. Primer, composed, not even a quiver of a smile. He didn't know what annoyed him more, that she'd hidden in his wagon, or that she'd managed to make it seem like he was the one being unreasonable. By noon the next day, the sun hung high and merciless over the plains. Dust clung to Wes's boots and sweat beaded under his collar. The wagon creaked along the dirt trail, wheels rattling over every dip and rut. Jane hadn't spoken in hours. She sat primly beside him, hands clasped in her lap, her bonnet shielding her face. Her back remained as straight as fence posts, and her expression unreadable, as if she were riding through Hyde Park instead of a bone-dry stretch of Texas. Wes tossed her a glance.
"You always this quiet?"
She blinked once.
"Would you prefer I talked more?"
He huffed a short laugh.
"Didn't say that."
"Then I'll assume silence suits you."
She turned her head slightly, looking out over the wide land. Wind stirred the ribbon tied at her throat. Wes flexed his fingers around the reins.
"You really plan to find work when we get to town?"
"I do."
"You ever worked a day in your life?"
She met his gaze evenly.
"Not in the way you mean, but I'm willing to learn."
"You'll learn fast, I promise you that."
He muttered. They passed a herd of longhorns grazing in the distance. Jane watched them thoughtfully.
"I suppose you think I'm ridiculous,"
she said after a moment.
"A girl from a respectable home, running away in the dead of night and hiding in a stranger's wagon."
"I didn't say that."
"But you think it."
Wes clicked his tongue.
"No, ma'am, I've seen plenty of ridiculous things. You don't make the top 5.
She gave the faintest smile. There and gone. He tilted his head toward her.
"So, what was he like? The man your folks wanted you to marry?"
Jane hesitated.
"He's my father's business associate, 40 years old, twice widowed, and very fond of giving orders.
Wes grimaced.
Charming.
He also smells of cigar smoke and sherry and refers to me as the quiet one.
That got a real laugh out of Wes.
Well, he got one thing right.
Jane didn't laugh, but her eyes sparkled with something dangerously close to amusement. Wes leaned back, one arm resting across the seat.
And you? You always do what you're told?
No, but I usually make it look like I do.
He barked another laugh.
Now that sounds more honest.
The wagon jostled over a bump, and Jane gripped the edge of the seat to steady herself. Wes glanced at her hands, small, delicate, the kind that had probably never scrubbed a floor or pulled a weed.
You won't like ranch work,
He said.
I don't expect to like it.
She replied, calm as ever.
I only expect to do it.
They fell into another long silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. She was different from any woman he'd ever met. Not coy, not flirtatious, not afraid either, just firm. And that, for some reason, made her harder to ignore. By the time the sun began to sink into the horizon, Wes had made up his mind. When they reached Coyote Bend, he'd point her toward a place that might take her in. The kind of work she could handle, something honest and decent. Until then, he'd keep his mouth shut and his eyes front. Even if he could feel her presence like a steady tug on his senses. By the time Wes drove the wagon into Coyote Bend, dusk had settled in, casting long shadows across the narrow streets. The town was quiet, just a few cowhands loitering outside the saloon and a dog asleep on the wooden steps of the general store. Jane stepped down from the wagon with quiet resolve, adjusting her skirts and bonnet. She looked every inch a lady, though the road dust clung stubbornly to her hem, and the sun had kissed a faint pink across her cheeks.
You sure you don't want me to talk to someone?
Wes asked, watching her hesitate.
I'll manage,
She replied.
Thank you for the ride, Mr. Callahan.
That was the first time she'd used his name. It made him frown for reasons he didn't examine. Jane turned and walked down the street with the same grace she had in the wagon, like a governess strolling through a garden instead of a woman with no place to go. Wes didn't drive off. He just sat there, hands on his thighs, watching her back. The first door she knocked on was the seamstress shop. No help needed, came the muffled voice inside. The second was the bakery. The woman there looked Jane up and down and said, You don't have the arms for kneading, sweetheart. At the third, Mrs. Tisdale's boarding house, the woman clucked her tongue and gave Jane a sympathetic look. You got references?
No, ma'am.
Then I can't take you. Too many girls running off with silver spoons in their sleeves these days. Jane thanked her politely and turned away, her spine straight despite the sting. It was nearly dark when she returned to the wagon. Wes was still there, leaned back with his hat low over his eyes like a man napping. But his posture was too still, too alert. He knew she hadn't found anything.
I'll find something in the morning,
She said quietly.
Town doesn't wake up early,
He replied without looking at her.
and you won't have a place to sleep while you wait.
I'll manage.
She said again. He exhaled slowly, then tipped his hat back and looked at her.
My ranch is 20 minutes out. Got a spare room, plenty of chores. It's not a permanent solution, but it's something.
Jane's gaze searched his face.
You'd offer me charity?
I'm offering you work.
She paused, then gave the smallest nod.
What kind of work?
Cleaning, mostly. Maybe cooking. My housekeeper's cousin just had twins. She left me 2 weeks ago and I've been living off beans and regret ever since.
Jane blinked.
I can clean.
I hope so. It's either you or the chickens, and they haven't volunteered.
Her lips twitched, and before she could stop herself, a soft laugh escaped. It was the first true sound of warmth he'd heard from her. Wes grinned.
Now that's better. I was starting to worry you didn't have teeth.
Jane looked away quickly, composing herself.
Thank you, I accept.
Good. Climb up, Miss Bennett. Home's just a mile out.
The moon was rising over the horizon when they pulled up to Callahan Ranch, a long, low house set against a backdrop of hills and prairie grass. A corral sat nearby with a few restless horses, and a dog barked once before trotting over to greet them. Jane looked at the land and the house, then at Wes.
You live alone?
He nodded.
It's quieter that way.
She didn't ask why, he didn't offer. Inside, the house smelled of old wood, leather, and the faintest hint of burnt coffee. It wasn't messy, but it wasn't tidy either. Wes gestured to a room off the main hallway.
That's yours. Wash basins inside. I'll bring your bag.
Jane stepped in. It wasn't large, but it was clean enough, better than she'd expected. As she sat on the edge of the bed, the door creaked behind her and Wes appeared in the doorway, her carpet bag in hand. He placed it down and looked at her with that unreadable expression of his.
I don't know why you left, but I'm guessing it took guts. You'll earn your keep here, but don't think I'll go easy just 'cause you've got manners and a fancy bonnet.
Jane met his eyes without flinching.
I never asked for easy, Mr. Callahan.
He stared for a long moment, then tipped his hat.
Good night, Miss Bennett.
And with that, he left her alone, with nothing but her pride, her secrets, and a slow, dawning awareness that she'd stepped into something far more complicated than she expected. The prairie wind whistled low through the cottonwoods as Jane carried a bucket of water across the ranch yard, her arms straining, her back aching. She'd been up since dawn baking bread and scrubbing the floors of the main house, but she didn't mind the work. It kept her hands busy and her thoughts from wandering most of the time. Wes Callahan was the real problem. He was everywhere, on horseback leading a roundup, hauling lumber for a new barn, whistling low while fixing a busted fence. He didn't talk much, not unless he had to, and never about anything personal. But he looked at her sometimes, really looked, like he was trying to figure out something he wasn't sure he wanted to know. And when he smiled, Lord, it felt like sunshine after a cold snap. Jane paused by the well and set the bucket down with a groan. She was catching her breath when she heard boots behind her. She turned, and there he was. Wes, shirt sleeves rolled up, hat tilted low, that maddening glint in his eyes like he knew something she didn't.
Water too heavy for you?
He asked, voice lazy but amused. She straightened, chin high.
Not at all. I'm perfectly capable.
He smirked and took the bucket anyway.
Never said you weren't. Just seems a waste letting you break your back when I've got two good arms doing nothing.
Is that your subtle way of saying you were watching me?
He blinked, caught off guard.
No.
He said, a beat too late. Jane arched a brow. Wes muttered something that sounded suspiciously like damn woman, but he didn't let go of the bucket. Instead, he walked with her toward the kitchen porch, the air between them charged with something they both refused to name. That evening, the ranch sat in a hush. Jane leaned against the porch rail, watching the sky turn peach and lavender over the hills. She didn't hear Wes approach until he dropped down beside her with 2 mugs, coffee for him, chamomile tea for her.
I noticed you've been working through supper,
He said quietly.
I prefer the quiet.
You always prefer the quiet.
Only when the company makes too much noise.
She teased, sipping her tea. He chuckled, slow and deep.
You always this sharp-mouthed?
Only when the man deserves it.
His gaze met hers then, steady and dark, and the teasing slipped away like mist. For a moment, the silence wasn't comfortable anymore. It was electric. Wes looked away first.
You ever think about what you'll do next?
He asked. Jane hesitated.
Not really. One day at a time, I suppose.
You could stay on here, long as you like.
That sounds dangerously close to kindness, Mr. Callahan.
He smiled, small and secretive.
Maybe I'm capable of a little.
Jane studied him, this man who rode like a storm and spoke like he didn't trust his own voice.
Why did you offer me a place here, Wes? Really?
He didn't answer right away, then softly,
Maybe I saw something worth keeping.
her breath caught, but before she could reply, he stood and tipped his hat.
Sleep well, Jane.
And just like that, he was gone, leaving her heart knocking against her ribs like a prisoner desperate to escape. 2 weeks passed, and Jane did her best to keep her head down and her heart in check. She scrubbed floors, cooked meals, and kept her distance. But Wes made it damn hard. He wasn't doing anything overt, just existing with that lazy, confident swagger, and those glances that lingered too long. And then his cousin showed up. Colt Callahan arrived with dust on his boots and charm in his smile. He was quick with a joke, quick to help, and quick to notice Jane.
You always this bossy?
She asked one afternoon when Colt caught her by the elbow to steady her as she stumbled over a fence rail.
Only when the lady's worth it,
He said, grinning wide. Jane laughed, and Wes saw it. From across the yard, Wes stood with his arms crossed, watching them. His jaw was tight, his eyes unreadable. Jane tried not to care, but her pulse skipped anyway. That night, Colt lingered by the kitchen as she cleaned up.
You ever think about leaving Wes's place?
He asked casually. Jane stilled.
Why would I?
Well, maybe I could use a hand over at my ranch. Fewer people, more quiet. I could pay well.
She hesitated, not because she disliked Wes's ranch, but because she was starting to feel too much. And Wes was engaged. There'd never be anything real between them.
I'll think about it.
She murmured. Wes found her later in the barn, brushing down one of the horses. She didn't hear him at first, not until he said,
So, you planning to run again?
She froze.
Excuse me?
You're thinking of leaving. Colt offered, didn't he?
She turned, eyes flashing.
I don't see how that's any of your concern.
He stepped closer, the barn suddenly too small.
It is my concern.
Why? Because I muck out your stalls? Cook your food? You're engaged, Wes. What I do or don't do.
You think this is about my damn engagement?
She blinked, taken aback.
Isn't it?
He swore under his breath and closed the space between them.
You drive me mad.
He said roughly.
You smile at my cousin, and I want to hit something. You talk back to me, and I can't stop thinking about it. You leave, and hell, I don't want you to leave.
Why?
She whispered. His hand came up, fingers curling just under her jaw.
Because I want you, and I shouldn't, but I do.
And then he kissed her, hard and sudden, like a match struck to dry kindling. Jane gasped against his mouth, heart hammering, hands fisted in his shirt. For one wild moment, the world narrowed to heat and longing, and the ache of what they couldn't have. When he pulled back, breathing heavy, he said nothing. Neither did she. He walked out without another word. The next morning, Jane packed her things. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't need to. By noon, she was on a wagon bound for Colt's ranch. The house felt wrong without her. Wes stalked from room to room like a man gone half mad. The kitchen was too quiet, the barn too still. Every time he turned a corner, he half expected her to be there, mouth ready with some sharp remark, hands on her hips, eyes dancing fire. But she wasn't. Jane had left, just like that, and she'd gone to Colt. Wes slammed his fist into the barn wall, splintering the wood and scaring the horses. He didn't care. All week he'd been trying to ignore what was plain. He wanted her. Not just in his bed, not just in passing. He wanted her in the damn marrow of his bones. But instead of saying so, he'd kissed her like a thief and left her like a coward. And now she was gone.
You look like hell.
Colt said 2 days later, when Wes showed up at his place.
I'm not here for pleasantries.
Wes snapped.
Where is she?
Colt arched a brow, setting down his coffee mug.
She's here, working, earning her keep.
She ain't yours.
She ain't yours either.
Colt returned coolly.
Far as I know, you're still promised to that rancher's daughter.
Wes didn't answer that. He pushed past his cousin and found Jane in the stables, sweeping hay. She stopped when she saw him. Her expression didn't change.
You lost?
No.
He said hoarsely.
I came to take you back.
She turned back to her work.
I'm not a cow to be herded.
I broke off the engagement.
That stilled her. When she looked back at him, her voice was quiet.
Why?
Because I want you.
He said, stepping closer.
Not her. Never her. I should have said it that night in the barn. I should have said it when you first looked at me with those big, defiant eyes. But I didn't, because I thought you'd run, and you did anyway.
I didn't run. I left. There's a difference.
He smiled a little, but it was strained.
You still mad?
Yes.
Still leaving?
I left.
Then marry me.
Jane blinked.
What?
You heard me. Marry me, Jane Bennett. Not because of duty or pride or any of the nonsense people marry for. Marry me because I'm half wild without you. Because you drive me out of my mind. Because I love you.
She stared at him for a long beat. Then she dropped the broom. Then she kissed him. That Sunday, Jane walked down the aisle in a borrowed dress, with wildflowers in her hair, and Wes looking at her like she was the last sunrise he'd ever see. They said "I do" beneath the open sky, surrounded by neighbours and a few curious cows. Wes didn't stop smiling, not even once. The morning sun spilled golden light across the Callahan ranch, casting long shadows from the porch rail as Jane leaned against it, sipping coffee from her favourite chipped mug. The hens were clucking, the breeze was warm, and somewhere behind her, her husband was cursing a saddle strap.
You all right out there, cowboy?
She called, amusement threading her voice.
Not unless you want to come fix this stubborn strap for me.
Wes shouted from the barn.
Swear it's possessed.
Jane grinned.
Try speaking sweetly to it. That's how you got me to stay, after all.
That ain't how I remember it.
He said, appearing in the doorway, shirt half-buttoned and straw in his hair.
If I recall, I practically begged, and you still made me sweat through half my dignity.
You didn't have that much dignity to begin with.
He walked up the steps, took her mug, and drank from it without asking.
That why you married me.
I married you because you told me you loved me.
And?
And because you kissed me like I was the only woman left on God's green earth.
He set the mug down and pulled her close.
Still do.
Life settled after the wedding, if you could call ranching life settled. Jane took to running the household like she'd been born to it, organising Wes's chaos with the same sharp tongue and soft heart that had won him over in the first place. The townsfolk whispered, of course. Some said Wes had gone mad, tossing aside the rich rancher's daughter for a runaway with no name. But Wes didn't care. He had Jane, and that was all he needed. One afternoon in late spring, Jane sat under the oak tree behind the house, thumbing through a well-worn book. Wes joined her, collapsing in the grass and tossing his hat aside.
You're glowing.
He said, watching her from the corner of his eye.
I'm hot.
No, you're glowing.
She lowered the book.
I was going to wait until supper to tell you.
Tell me what?
She placed his hand on her belly. Wes blinked, then blinked again, and then his whole face lit up like sunrise.
Jane Callahan, are you saying?
I'm saying you'd better fix that cradle in the attic.
He laughed, loud and unfiltered, before tackling her gently to the grass and kissing her until she squealed.
Reckless woman,
He murmured into her neck.
Reckless man.
She breathed back. They lay there under the wide blue Texas sky, tangled in each other, hearts full and futures bright. Because sometimes love didn't arrive quiet and proper. Sometimes it came in like a storm, with dust and fire and fury. And sometimes, if you were lucky, it stayed forever.